Hi, my name's Nathan, and welcome to Serenity and Sobriety. Today, I am 11 days sober again. I say again because recently, on April 7th, I'd reached 6 years of recovery. So, what happened? Where am I going? And how were those 6 years before? This video series is going to be about my journey. Today, I'm going to talk about my rock bottom, the day that I knew I had to quit alcohol. It was April 7th, 2019, and I ended up on the streets homeless in Prince George, downtown. I had a family member help me get into one of the shelters. I can't believe that my life had come to that point. Nobody wanted me. No family, no friends, nobody. I knew that I'd done that myself by the choices that I've made at that point. And all I could do was just feel sorry for myself. I remember making some phone calls that day to get me into detox because I was quite sick and they had no bed for me. So that evening, I had to check in at 6 o'clock so I can get a bed. I remember that first night, I shared a room with 3 other people. It was one of the scariest things that I've ever had to go through. I didn't know them, they were strangers to me. I had barely slept that night. I remember thinking to myself, I put myself in this situation. How am I going to get out? And the only thing that I could think of was to just quit. But quit what? Alcohol was nothing but a substance that I used to get what I needed. Alcohol was my best friend up until that point. Who else could I rely on? I couldn't rely on myself. At least I didn't think so. I remember saying to myself that if I could turn my life around 180 degrees and just start walking out of that hole that I had walked into, then maybe I could really turn my life around. Because you see, my rock bottom was bottomless until I came crashing down. And up until that point, I finally crashed. I remember not getting much sleep that night because of the situation I was in, and I didn't trust anybody else in that room. So when I woke up finally, I went to the common area and I started watching TV with a few others that were in there. It was a few hours later, sitting there amongst everybody else, and people started showing up, that I got a call to the front desk, and it was the hospital. A bed had opened up for me, and they told me to be there at noon. So I thought to myself, what am I going to do? Where am I going to put the rest of my things? I could only take so much up there. The shelter agreed to put one of my bags in a closet that was able to be locked so it wouldn't be stolen. A few hours later, I started making my way up to detox. I remember getting up there and barely being able to sign my name. I was shaking so bad. I knew I had a real problem then. I had stayed there for 4 days, and in those 4 days, I had a doctor's visit, and they took some tests. And the one morning that I met the doctor, I was afraid to hear the worst about what I'd done to my body. However, the doctor said that if I quit and never drink again, that my liver would get better to a normal person. I remember sitting there thinking to myself as the doctor's talking to me, hearing the best news that I could think of at that time. What is normal anyways? Here I am, sitting in detox, trying to get better. I remember leaving detox and thinking that I had nowhere else to go. So I made my way back down to the shelter and I talked to the people at the front desk and I asked if I could have a room that night, and they said to be back at 6 p.m. For the next month, that was my life. I had to be there at 6 p.m. to get a bed. For the next month, my life was to adjust to living on the streets and in the shelter, not knowing anybody. One of the first things that I did was to find some structure. So at 9 o'clock in the morning, I would end up at St. Vincent's. St. Vincent's back then was busy. Everybody from around downtown went there. There was usually around 40 to 50, maybe 60 people at any given time, all going for breakfast, all going for a coffee. I remember that I would sit alone and people would start sitting around with me and I would just watch. I would watch people, I would watch them interact, and I would wonder, how can I insert my life into this and survive? Part of that structure was to go to a fellowship. When I was in detox, there was a program called Sobriety that I know nothing about, but I soon found out that it was like AA. However, it was geared towards the indigenous. So at that point, I started going on Mondays and Fridays. I remember over the next 90 days that I stayed off social media and I didn't contact anybody because I didn't want anybody to know where I was. I was ashamed. I also remember in those first 90 days that I had to come up with something for myself. And that thing was to be honest to myself. I could lie to anybody at that point, but I couldn't lie to myself. Over the next few months, there were a few individuals that I became friends with. People that I started talking to and that I started hanging around with. I remember there was a period of 2 weeks that, because the shelter fed me and I was able to get what I needed, that I found out that I was in the perfect setting, that I didn't have to go anywhere. At that point, for some reason, I loved living on the streets. There was so much chaos and everything, and I found out that that was my new addiction. After that 2 weeks, I shook my head and I started seeing a counselor, and I kept on going to Sobriety. One of the counselors that I saw asked me if I wanted to go to treatment. I remember thinking to myself, well, I guess, I know there are people far worse than me. And here I was lying to myself. So I stopped and I said, yes, I will go. So we made a plan to apply to Round Lake Treatment Center. The reason why I chose that wasn't because I knew the program or I knew that anybody else had gone there. It was because it was in the Okanagan and I wanted to spend a summer down there to see what it was like. I'm thankful that I trusted my intuition because what I got out of that place was amazing. I remember back then, I had no one to support me. I was by myself, living downtown Prince George in a shelter with the few friends that I would talk with, and I would stay away from certain areas. I would spend most of my days at the library or just walking around. That's the thing about rock bottom. What I found out was that my rock bottom was bottomless until I came crashing down. Now I want to talk about the video series that I'm about to make. I actually asked AI to come up with 200 topics for me to talk about in my journey. I gave him a little bit about myself and what had happened because of my relapse in my 6 years and what I'm going to do after. What am I going to do? I got to keep this on me because it is my journey. I'm willing to share my journey with you in hopes that it could be a guide to know that you're not alone. We all have stories. I also want to say that making a video is extremely hard. I have done 60 takes. I am just getting used to this, so I hope you will bear with me and I will get better as time goes on. I want to thank everybody in my life right now. Being 11 days sober, I feel raw with my emotions and my feelings. I have so many people to support me this time around. I remember when I told my roommate that I'd relapsed, and she had known the whole time. She asked me, "Why weren't you honest?" And I said that she didn't say anything to me. That's the way my mind works. If they don't acknowledge it, I'm going to try and get away with it. And at that point, it lasted for 13 days. Thank goodness, only 13 days. Those 13 days, I just wanted to numb my feelings for what I had recently gone through. There was 2 tracks, and they came and they collided, and it just made the perfect storm. I also told my parents, and I told my brother, and I told some other coworkers. I find it a little hard to talk about. However, I want to talk about this because I need to get my story out there. I wanted to do this the first time around, but I had no resources. I've built up a life for myself, and I just about threw that away. If my story helps somebody else, then I will be okay with it. As I continue making these videos, they will get longer and you won't be able to shut me up. I am so nervous right now that I just want to edit this and get it online so everyone can hear my story. For the time being, I have taken some time off work to look after myself. So I want to thank you for watching. Please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel and continue on with my journey with me as I talk about these 200 some topics in the coming months.